separate time preparing these slides that social entrepreneurship is very much a balancing act. And why is it a balancing act? It's because you're trying to create blended value as a social entrepreneur or as a social enterprise. That's what you're doing. And as a social entrepreneur, you're making that conscious decision to partake in this quite delicate dance of satisfying various forms of value creation. And just a little quote here from during the research that we've been doing. One of the social enterprise consultants that we spoke with in the UK suggested that running a social enterprise is like trying to juggle 3 balls at once. The 3 balls he was referring to are people, planet, and profit. And most people cannot actually juggle 3 balls. And that's basically what it comes down to, that you need to juggle these 3 balls, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can do it on your own. You need support in this. You need people, organizations to help you through that process. Just to give you a little bit of an idea for anyone who doesn't know too much about this concept of multiple objectives, if you look at this graph, this picture over here, you see that on the left-hand side we have NGOs, philanthropic organizations that have a very strong social mandate. On the right-hand side, we have for-profit run businesses, so commercial entities that are there to make a buck. And in the middle, you have what people have different definitions of the term, but let's generically call it a social business or a social enterprise. This is something that's right in the middle, and ideally speaking, if you're right in the middle, you reach a point of financial sustainability, which means that you reinvest your profits back into the business so that you have more social impact. So your social mandate comes first, but you do this through a financial commercial means. And because of that, you create more. You have blended value that you create. So on the one hand, you're looking at creating economic value. You're looking to generate revenues. But on the other hand, you also have social values. And these social values, this is where it can get quite complex. You can have multiple social values that you're trying to fulfill, and you're trying to, as a business, you're trying to figure out, okay, how much time or any resource, really, financial resources, skills, how much time do I dedicate to satisfying my commercial mandate? How much time do I place on satisfying my social mandate? And this is a constant struggle for social enterprises. And what I'm suggesting, or what the research is suggesting, is that this challenge, which we refer to as mission drift, is the fundamental challenge that social enterprises face. So mission drift refers to the concept of drifting away from something. So when you think of your mission, you have a social mission, but you can drift away from that social mission when for some time you've placed too much emphasis on the commercial orientation of the company. At the same time though, often the commercial orientation of the company is super important, because without that, you're not going to have any social impact anyways. So how do you, ensure that you keep improving your social objective, your social mandate, while at the same time improving your commercial mandate or your commercial performance? So you have to kind of figure out how to do this, and what that can often lead to is mission drift, where you focus too much on one or too much of the other. And what I'd like you to think about is if this is a fundamental core problem of social enterprises. And in my opinion, it is. In my opinion, if you look at mission drift, it impacts pretty much every single challenge that social enterprises face, be it resource limitations, the need for multiple performance measurements. So you're not only trying to measure your commercial viability, how well you're doing in the books, in the financial books, but also how well are you doing in terms of social impact performance. Multi-stakeholder engagement. Suddenly you're dealing with a lot more stakeholders. Our research suggests that there's a very high dependency of social enterprises on a relationship with a local NGO in order to gain and create trust with the local community that they're trying to help. But at the same time, they might have a social investor or an impact investor on board that they also need to satisfy in a totally different way. So you're juggling a lot of different stakeholders, possibly more so when than if you were a nonprofit organization or a purely commercial entity. Access to finance. Suddenly you have access to grants, but you also have access to impact investors. How does this impact your legal structure? These are all things that stem off from mission drift. Market competitiveness, organizational culture, and leadership challenges. Leadership challenges is a big one in my opinion as well, where as a leader you have to figure out, what resources do we need to satisfy this mandate versus that mandate. So you're constantly kind of doing this balancing act, this dance between various value creation. And then what ICS in context for the last 3 years have kind of been looking at what support organizations are doing to address the problems and the challenges that social enterprises face. And just a quote there, in order to survive, organizations depend on their environment for access to resources. So I want you to think about, as an ecosystem, as if you think of if you imagine a support ecosystem around social entrepreneurs, what does that look like, and how can we improve that ecosystem? Now, the research we did suggests that on the one hand, you have organizations that want to achieve some change, and on the other hand, you have the communities and the people that they want to benefit. So what we tried to figure out is what are support providers doing and what is their role within that life cycle of a social enterprise. What we saw is that you have various layers of support within a typical social enterprise ecosystem. So at the top level you have government institutions, then you have what's called Kwangos, which are quasi-non-governmental organizations that are basically set up by governments, but they are independently run. Within that, which is kind of a blurry line, you have supporting intermediaries, which are typically the support providers that give some sort of provision or support to social entrepreneurs that are on the front line. And the question is not necessarily how do we only support the front line, the question is also how do you support the other levels? Or perhaps as an organization you have better resources to support intermediaries, so the NGOs that are involved in supporting social enterprises rather than getting involved in the front line. We've seen a lot of these kind of activities where there's almost a value chain of support that you can speak of. So what is your role then as a support provider in tackling or creating a better social entrepreneurship ecosystem? If you look at the red line is, let's say, a typical business life cycle. Consider that the typical business life cycle. We found that support is quite fragmented. So the support that's offered by organizations is quite fragmented. So we see a slight lack of support at the beginning so pre-startup, and we see a lack of support in that phase kind of between startup and growth. This is typically where the least organizations get involved in offering support. What we also see is that, so the box on the left is more pre-startup startup, and the box on the right is more growth and scalability, is that the types of organizations that get involved in social entrepreneurship support radically differ as you travel along the life cycle. So, and this is a generalization here, this is not the rule, but in general you can say that NGOs and Kwangos are more likely to be involved at the earlier stages because they are less risk averse when it comes to financial performance, and they're more involved in the social mandate. So they're not too worried about how well the financial performance of the social enterprise does. Later on, however, we see that more impact investors and banks start to enter the support ecosystem because they realize that risk is slightly diminishing, models are showing the ability to scale. That's a great entry point for them. But because of this difference in the types of support providers along the business life cycle, you also have it affects the way the organizational systems and structures and processes of the social enterprise. So for example, the nature of the support is very different. You might have more grants and donor support in the beginning versus equity, loans, impact investors coming in later on in the life cycle. And that affects the way you have to report, that affects often your communication style, etc., etc. So we've kind of found that there's a couple things to look at. First, who are the support providers? the nature of that support, the type of support being offered changes radically as well, and then the reporting culture changes as well. Based on that, we thought, okay, what are the fundamental question here is not that there are challenges. The fundamental question is more, how can we better align the support offerings as they exist to support social enterprise challenges as they grow? That's the fundamental question we want to answer. And we found that there's we kind of split the findings into three overarching issues. So there's technical issues, we can support them in technical ways, there's cultural issues, and there's resource limitation issues. So I'll briefly run you through those. So firstly, the technical issues, you're looking at the types of financing options that are available to social entrepreneurs changes along the life cycle. So how do you prepare them, or how can you help prepare them as they transition from one part of a life cycle to another? Secondly, we look at grant applications versus pitching to investors. This is a good example. If you're writing grant proposals versus preparing a pitch to a financially oriented investor, there's a very different approach, not only in terms of the documentation you have to deliver, but also in terms of how you present yourself. Grant reporting versus technical financial reporting. The performance metrics change along the way as well. And we found that if you have to transition as a social enterprise from a more grant-based performance system to a more commercial, technically, or financially viable reporting system, this can chew or eat up into your resources. So should it be the social enterprise that tackles those resources, or should the social enterprise support provider be more involved in perhaps measuring the impact for them so that they don't have to do that? These are all kind of questions to ponder and think about. There's also a changing governance structure and levels of control. As the social enterprise becomes more investment ready, we find that controlling governance increases. There's a higher demand on that. There's also a shift in organizational culture. So firstly, there's a shift in the manner that organizations need to communicate, or social enterprises need to communicate with their support provider. There's also this fundamental question basically impacts the organizational style and culture within the social enterprise, and that being, is the business viable, or is there an opportunity for high social impact? So if we go to the left of the life cycle, we see that the second question, is there opportunity for high social impact, is more relevant. Whereas if you start reaching a point of scalability, you realize that the question, is the business viable or financially, commercially viable, that question becomes much more of an issue. And that issue reflects itself onto the social enterprise and how it then represents itself to the outside world, its stakeholders, et cetera, et cetera. So you get a lot of communication and cultural issues here. And that in itself has implications on leadership. So leaders have to think, how do they manage their stakeholders as a result of the type of support they're trying to get? How do they manage themselves internally, and also just personally, how do they change as a person? These are all issues to ponder and think about. Resource limitations. Social enterprises are by nature constrained by resource limitations anyhow. And it's great that organizations want to provide support, but it's also important that they do that in a manner which is in the interest of the social enterprise first, and not in the interest of them themselves, if possible, as much as possible. So what we see is that often because the support is quite fragmented, you have to change the way you allocate time, resources, people, skills, and capital to gain certain types of support. What we also see is that the types of resources that you have to dedicate to gain grants and investment applications changes along the life cycle as well. The type of resources that you have to dedicate to understanding the reporting standards as you move along the life cycle changes as well. So these are all things to reflect on and to consider. And just to finish off, I would just like to suggest some of the more overarching questions or thoughts that we came up with as a result. And these are things that we would like people that are involved in the ecosystem to kind of think and reflect on. Social entrepreneurship, in my opinion, is still very much an evolving and changing sector or or entity. So we haven't figured it out yet, and that's okay. That's actually a beautiful thing because we get to figure it out together, figure out how to go on from 2015 to 2016, etc. But let's try to work together and figure out how to do that. So one of the things to think about is when you're offering support, do you also need to offer dedicated support in the acquisition process of support? So when the social enterprise is trying to acquire support, they need to dedicate resources to that. They also need to dedicate resources to, after having received the support, utilizing that support and evaluating that support. So could the support provider play much more of a role in that process as well? So not just coming in and giving them some money, but perhaps dedicating skills and resources and part of their organization to tackling the evaluation process, the performance measurement that they have to tackle. Secondly, how can we ensure that social enterprises gain the help they need during support gaps to progress to the next level? So as I showed you in the previous graph, there's certain support gaps at the beginning of the business life cycle and kind of in the phase between startup and growth. If those support gaps are genuine things within your ecosystem, within whatever ecosystem you're involved in, how can you tackle those? Or is that an opportunity to get involved? Thirdly, radical change is by nature more cumbersome and resource intensive compared to incremental change. Because the demands on social enterprises change quite radically as they go to gain support, as they go from startup to growth, they have to change a lot of things, which are the technical issues, the organizational issues, the resource issues. They have to consider all that, and that's very intensive on their resources, and they might have to change a lot radically. So what I'm suggesting is that the next point, if support was stretched more from left to right, and by left to right I mean in this graph, you see that typically more impact investors and more technical players get involved at the right, and more social impact-oriented players get involved on the left. What if there was more of a merging and more of a collaborative approach between the support providers themselves, so that social enterprises would have a much smoother transition from one form of support to the next? And that's not only up to them, that's also up to the support providers to think more reflectively and put the social enterprise first so that they can together figure out what to do. And then just to finish off, it's important to remember that social enterprises are not black and white organizational models. Their struggle is quite unique. It's something to think about. How can we help them within various aspects of their struggle? There's still a lot of challenges that they face. So there's not really a one-size-fits-all solution. So everyone can play their own role in tackling that. And secondly, as practitioners, researchers, and policymakers, we should take up that task of exploring new collaborative forms of support provision to improve the support ecosystem. Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe you can bring up the last slide. I can do it now as well. Just one thing to figure out, so where is the best place to hold the microphone? Because I have a sense that, so is it here?
Yeah, that's okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Right, okay. I think this really sets the stage for the symposium and sets the ambition that we have here together with sort of this collective ecosystem that we have in the room here. So we are actually very much looking forward to the exchanges and the ideas. Based on our analysis, we came up with a couple of topics where we really felt that we needed to have that discussion. So in a couple of minutes, we'll have a session on the financing gap, which is an important issue for most enterprises, definitely also social enterprises. We see that business development services focused on entrepreneurial development, management development, organizational development are key. There are many models out there, but which ones are the ones that are actually working and which ones are the ones that are effective and efficient? So in the afternoon we'll pay attention to that one. Now tomorrow we'll have a look at the role of the government, because it's clear that in order to create a conducive environment for these social enterprises, that there is a role for the government to play as well. So we'll do that tomorrow morning. And the impact question, as a social enterprise, when you're very tight in your budget and you need to manage your P&L, where and how do you find ways to measure your social impact if you're a social enterprise? So we'll have a good discussion on that one tomorrow, sorry. We had one yesterday as well. We'll also have breakout sessions where we focus on different themes and different sectors, so that will be tomorrow. So again, we're really looking forward to this. I'm going to give the microphone to Andrew, and he's going to walk us to the next step, right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe a round of applause again. Thank you for this. I think it's time for a short coffee break. So we're doing 30 minutes, or because we're running late a bit.
So let's do 20.
20. Is that okay? 20 minutes, and then we like to see you again. Some coffee, it's outside. Oh, and by the way, please do not forget to fill in the survey, and because we would love to give you feedback at the end of the day.
I can leave it on the table.
Leave the surveys on the table. Again, you don't need to sign it with your name. Just